I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Shipments of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine are about to be accelerated. After a month-long slowdown as the drug maker expanded its plant in Belgium, the federal government says it expects to receive weekly shipments of more than 400,000 doses beginning this week and lasting into early April. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also said today that the head of Moderna has assured him the company will meet its contract to ship 2 million doses of its COVID-19 vaccine by the end of next month. The majority of respondents to a new poll on COVID-19 vaccine deliveries blame the federal government for delays. An online survey by Leger and the Association for Canadian Studies says 69% of respondents believe Canada is behind on deliveries due to federal trouble obtaining doses on the global market. Only 14% of respondents point the finger at provincial governments. Residents remain divided on whether they will be able to roll up their sleeves before October, with 44% confident that they will and 51% skeptical. Well, there's new guidance from Canada's National Advisory Committee on Immunization as to who should be next for priorities for COVID-19 shots. It says adults from racialized communities disproportionately affected by the pandemic are one group. The other recommendation is for all essential workers who can't do their jobs from home. That's instead of focusing on health workers with lower risk jobs. The second stage is expected to start this spring. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh is calling for a quicker, clearer vaccination plan that would see Canada's military deployed across the country to speed up provincial COVID-19 inoculation efforts. Mr. Singh says Ottawa should engage military personnel, along with more medical and nursing students and retired healthcare workers, to ramp up Canada's faltering vaccine rollout. The announcement was presented as a campaign-style pledge ahead of a possible election this year. The Canadian Armed Forces has been called in to help set up COVID-19 screening centres for travellers. All non-essential travelers arriving at the border by land will be tested starting February 22nd before they are allowed entry. They will still be required to quarantine for 14 days, after which they will be retested. The Public Health Agency of Canada is looking at setting up testing sites at 16 border crossings with assistance from the military and other federal departments. The report that led to Julie Payette's resignation as Governor-General was published only in English. That prompted a complaint to Canada's Official Languages Commissioner. Conservative Senator Claude Carignan notes that the government paid for the report produced by Quintet Consulting after investigations of allegations of a toxic work environment at Rideau Hall. He urges Commissioner Raymond Thaberge to consider investigating the matter, as the report is of great interest to Canadians. A group of prominent Canadians is calling on the CBC to rethink its decision to cut staff and rebrand the globally focused Radio Canada International. It says the CBC is planning to cut 13 full-time staff and 3 contract jobs from a staff of about 20. They have sent Prime Minister Justin Trudeau a letter signed by 32 prominent Canadians, including former Prime Minister Joe Clark and former Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations, Stephen Lewis, asking for the decision to be reversed. University faculty, student, and labor groups are calling on the federal government to increase its spending on post-secondary education to address access and affordability problems that have been aggravated by the pandemic. The coalition of groups made their request in a report released today called Education for All. The groups warn that the rising cost of post-secondary education, coupled with the unemployment caused by the pandemic, will reduce access to education and training. One of Canada's most recognized marketing campaigns is going fully digital. Tim Hortons says its Roll Up the Rim to Win contest is now called Roll Up to Win. The chain says instead of rolling up a coffee tab to reveal a printed message, customers will scan a loyalty card or app at the time of purchase. Customers earn a roll for every hot or cold beverage and breakfast sandwich. Bitcoin-based exchange-traded funds are getting the go-ahead from Canadian regulators, creating a path for a fund structure that investment managers say is unique to the industry. Toronto-based Purpose Investments says its Bitcoin ETF will likely start trading this week under the symbol BTCC, after the fund worked with regulators to make sure it could create something that follows the rules for both the ETF market and the digital asset industry. Statistics Canada says manufacturing sales rose 0.9% to $54.2 billion in December, led by sales of wood products, transportation equipment, and petroleum and coal products. The agency says there were record high sales of wood products in the final month of 2020, as higher lumber prices pushed sales up 8.3%. Petroleum and coal product sales rose 4.7% amid higher energy prices in December, and there was a 26.9% uptick in sales of railroad rolling stock as transportation equipment sales rebounded. Up next, we take you around the world, starting in the U.S. as President Biden found himself facing pressure at the border. Stay tuned. U.S. President Joe Biden is facing mounting pressure at the border as thousands of people are waiting to claim asylum and more are coming each day. They falsely believe that they will be able to enter the U.S. now that former President Donald Trump is out of office. While President Biden has made major changes to his predecessor's hardline immigration policies, he hasn't lifted the major restrictions to people seeking asylum. Police in Myanmar have filed a new charge against ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Her lawyer told reporters after meeting with a judge that Ms. Suu Kyi has been charged with violating Article 25 of the Natural Disaster Management Law, which has been used to prosecute people who have broken coronavirus restrictions. The new charge may allow her to be held indefinitely without trial because a change in the penal code permits detention without court permission. Peaceful demonstrations against Myanmar's military takeover have resumed today. It follows violence against protesters a day earlier by security forces and after internet access was blocked for a second straight night. Demonstrators turned out in Yangon and other cities to repeat their protests against this month's coup. They demand that the country's elected leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, and members of her ousted government be freed from detention. A Dutch court has ordered the government to end the curfew it imposed last month, saying that the ruling coalition was not entitled to use emergency powers to enforce the restrictive measure. The government extended the 9 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. curfew to March 2nd last week. It used a law allowing it to bypass the usual legislative process in emergencies. However, the court says the introduction to the curfew did not require the use of the fast-track process, as it has been discussed at length during the coronavirus crisis. Australia's government says it will amend draft laws that would make Google and Facebook pay for news to clarify that publishers would be paid in lump sums rather than per click on news article links. The legislative amendments follow weekend discussions with Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai, the chief executive of Google. The Conservative government hopes to enact the so-called News Media Bargaining Code before the current session of Parliament ends next week. The leaders of New Zealand and Australia are engaged in a bitter fight over which country will inherit an alleged Islamic State militant who at one point held citizenship in both nations. Turkey's defense ministry said that the 26-year-old woman and 2 children were detained when they tried to illegally cross from Syria into Turkey. New Zealand and Australia have been arguing about which country should take responsibility for the woman if she is deported from Turkey. Iran State TV says Iranian and Russian militaries have kicked off a joint naval drill in the Indian Ocean aimed at boosting security on maritime trade in the region. Units from Iran's Navy and the powerful Revolutionary Guards Navy will take part in the exercise dubbed Iran-Russia Maritime Security Belt 2021 in the northern part of the Indian Ocean. An Iranian admiral says a Russian destroyer, a logistics ship, and a helicopter were to participate in the drill. 2 Hong Kong democracy activists have pleaded guilty for organizing or participating in an illegal assembly during massive anti-government protests in 2019. The 2, both former members of the Hong Kong legislature, were among 9 prominent activists whose trial began today. The charges are widely seen as a move by China to crack down on dissent in the semi-autonomous territory. It's nearly launch time for the United Nations' unprecedented program to deploy COVID-19 vaccines for hundreds of millions in need around the globe. More than 2 months after countries like Canada, Britain, and the United States started immunizing their most vulnerable people, the UN's health agency has approved a vaccine developed by Oxford University and AstraZeneca. The move could trigger the release of hundreds of millions of doses by the UN's COVAX initiative. Some big changes are coming to a luxury automobile manufacturer. Jaguar is aiming to be fully electric by 2025. The British company has outlined a plan to phase out internal combustion engines for the struggling brand. A British car industry lobby group says the announcement for the 86-year-old Jaguar model represents an injection of confidence into the sector, which has suffered due to COVID-19. Kenya Wildlife Service has some good news for the endangered rhino species in the country. Despite the conservation threats posed by the COVID-19 pandemic on the endangered species, in 2020, not a single rhino was poached, something that hasn't happened since the last 2 decades. The organization attributes the decrease to travel restrictions in 2020, but also teamwork with local communities, anti-poaching efforts, rangers, and conservation efforts. KWS Director General Brigadier John Wawaru says the poaching of rhinos has reduced by 90% in the past 7 years. Stay with us. This past week, we learned that approximately 7% of all positive COVID-19 cases in Ontario are variants of the virus. We spoke about these developments in our TIA Health medical segment this past week. Concerns are growing around the possibility of a third wave of the pandemic as new, more contagious variants of the coronavirus are popping up in the most remote parts of the country. Alberta alone confirmed 50 new cases of the UK variant known as B117 over the Family Day weekend. The province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, says the growing number of new cases that are not linked to travel but rather community spread are concerning. Meanwhile, Canadian officials have logged over 500 cases of more transmissible strains in the country, including in 2 remote First Nations communities. Medical experts are calling this a race against time between vaccinations and infections. Well, to talk more on these developments in our TIA Health medical segment, we are joined by Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Now, some really concerning developments in terms of these new variants, Dr. Raut. We know of 3 so far in Canada that were first discovered in the UK, South Africa, and Brazil. So how do these variants differ in terms of their spread compared to the original coronavirus?
That's a good question. So we know a lot about the B117, which is the UK variant. It's something that emerged in September of last year and really was the first variant to draw huge public attention because it was 70% more transmissible due to a lot of coding and mutation issues. By December 2020, almost 60% of all cases in London were based on this variant and, of course, has come to Canada as well. We know about the South African variant here, which is spreading quite rapidly in many provinces because of a higher viral load, and it also makes it a little bit more infectious compared to other variants. And then finally, most concerning here, we're seeing the P1 lineage, which is the Brazilian variant here. It's triggered even more deadly outbreaks than the first outbreak in March 2020, and it has a lot of features of the UK variant. So the big concern here is about vaccination effectiveness for them.
So some really interesting comparisons there, Dr. Raut. Would you say any of these strains or variants are more deadly or dangerous than the other?
That's the concern here, because if we look at all three of them do have things that make them more dangerous and deadly now. The changes in the mutations for the B117 has increased the transmissibility and also disease severity. The B131 and the P1 both seem to cause more deadly disease compared to the original coronavirus as well.
And why are cases of the UK variant popping up in even the most remote communities? And there are also cases of new variants that have no travel history as well. So what does all of this mean, Dr. Raut?
Yeah, so when we see that in remote communities, we know that they still rely on outside supplies, groceries, food, and essential services that still need to be maintained. So even without travel history, we can see that these variants can be spread through these manners there. More significantly, what it tells us is that if the remote communities are starting to see these strains, it means it's likely much more prevalent in the non-remote communities than we think.
And meanwhile, we have provincial officials slowly easing their lockdown restrictions. How will this impact the spread of these new variants, Doctor?
So we saw the second wave peaking mostly because of December gatherings, and lockdowns tended to shut that down quite a bit, including gatherings there. So we do expect that as these restrictions ease, we will see a bit more of a spread here. The important thing here is for people to be very careful and cautious and make sure the gatherings are reduced as much as possible.
And Canada's second stage of vaccinations is expected to start this spring, but how likely would Canada already be in a third wave of this pandemic by then?
That's a great question. So the thought is that Canada will likely already be in that third wave. We have to assume that these new variants will spread very rapidly, and that third wave is unfortunately only a matter of time.
I want to go back to some new vaccine guidance from Canada's National Advisory Committee on Immunization. They're saying that officials should look into vaccinating other groups instead of just focusing on healthcare workers with lower risk jobs. So what does that mean, Dr. Rout? What would that look like?
So it's a great thought here. So many populations are exposed because of increased risk of exposure to the actual coronavirus itself, but many populations have an increased risk of severe disease or death. And the idea is to look at those populations and prioritize them. Racialized populations, low-income groups, advanced age, and those with pre-existing medical conditions should really be part of the initial treatments for vaccinations to help prevent that severe disease.
All right, Dr. Rout, about 30 seconds left, but what else needs to be done to prevent the third wave of the pandemic from hitting us?
I think overall we should look at good infrastructure for schools and facilities to reopen. The most important things we learned from previous were rapid testing, contact tracing, limited gatherings, and vaccinating as many people as possible. All
right, Dr. Rout, again, always great having you on Forum Daily, sir. Thank you. All right, stay tuned for a look across the country up next on our Forum Daily Week in Review, starting in BC, where veterinarians in the province said there is a shortage of people in their profession. Meanwhile, UBC students were given significant fines for violating COVID safety restrictions, and the Business Council of Alberta suggests a harmonized sales tax. These stories and more coming up next. Veterinarians in Penticton, BC say there's a shortage of people in their profession. Dr. Stephen Ganton of the South Okanagan Animal Care Centre says the shortage of vets is leading to burnout and mental health struggles. The comments come after Penticton residents addressed City Council on the need for around-the-clock veterinary services in the region. Dr. Ganton says the suicide rate for veterinarians is 400% that of dentists. The RCMP has given several students at the University of British Columbia a lesson in COVID-19 compliance. The Mounties say in a news release that they handed out more than $5,000 in fines at the Point Grey campus for violating restrictions on social gatherings. Officers issued two $2,300 fines to organizers of the gatherings and two personal $230 fines. Constable Christina Martin says people were well aware of the orders 1 year into this pandemic, and we all have to do our part. Vancouver police say 130 people have been arrested in a crackdown launched in response to a sharp increase in armed shoplifting in the downtown core. Inspector Rob Clark says police saw a 260% increase last year in shoplifting incidents in the area involving weapons. Mr. Clark says he hopes the 4-week crackdown that ended last Friday sends a message that thieves are being watched and can expect to be arrested and charged. A report by an organization that represents more than 90 chief executives says a harmonized sales tax and a carbon tax could help provide Alberta with the revenue it needs to handle its growing debt. The Business Council of Alberta says it is concerned about the province's finances. It says the province needs to make some tough decisions about revenues and expenses to bring Alberta back to a more sustainable position. A University of Alberta planetary geologist says he will be in his living room in Edmonton today, but his heart will be on Mars. Chris Hurd, one of the select team of scientists working with NASA, is planning to watch the space agency's Perseverance rover touch down. The rover will snatch up between 20 and 35 core samples from the red planet's surface and shuttle them back to Earth. Mr. Hurd's job, together with his colleagues, will be to monitor the rover and tell it when to sample. An Alberta church pastor has been remanded in custody for refusing to agree to bail conditions after being charged a second time with breaking COVID-19 public health rules. Grace Life Church west of Edmonton has been defying health orders for weeks, holding services that officials say break rules on maximum attendance, masking and distancing. Pastor James Coates has addressed the issue in his messages, telling worshippers that churches have a duty to challenge and push government back into the proper path. The federal government's proposed municipal handgun ban is getting mixed reviews in Manitoba. Winnipeg Mayor Brian Bowman says if it goes ahead, the city would take action, but a national handgun ban would be more effective. The Association of Manitoba Chiefs of Police says it will keep an open mind, but notes that Canada already has significant restrictions on handguns, and it is uncertain how municipal bylaws would make current laws more effective. Ontario's two largest COVID-19 hotspots say easing restrictions now will likely lead to more illness and deaths. The medical officers of health for Toronto and Peel region are asking the province to delay loosening restrictions until March 9th. As it stands, the regions are set to move back into the color-coded system of restrictions on February 22nd. The doctors made the request in a letter to the province's chief medical officer. New modeling out of Quebec suggests a more contagious COVID-19 variant could end up dominating in the Montreal area in a matter of weeks. Health officials said yesterday that 16 cases were confirmed to be of the UK strain, while they were still looking at another 135 suspected infections. Overall, the province reported 800 new infections and added 14 more deaths from past dates, but no new ones. A New Brunswick woman is calling for an apology from hospital officials after her mother was kicked out by security forces for holding her father's hand. Kim Cravatin says her father has Alzheimer's and is living at the Moncton Hospital waiting for a nursing home bed. Ms. Cravatin admits that her mother was warned not to hold her husband's hand by a nurse, but says there was no need for such a severe reaction from the hospital. The province's health minister says the most vulnerable patients need to be protected because of the health risks posed by the pandemic. The 4 Atlantic provinces have launched a new website to promote the region's seafood to international export markets. The Seafood from Canada website is intended to connect seafood suppliers in the region with buyers in key export markets. The Atlantic region is world-renowned for producing some of the most exceptional seafood in the world. Canadian seafood is exported to more than 130 countries. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you can visit our website at thenewsforum.ca and make sure to follow us on our social media handles. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for updates. You can also watch all of our news and commentary programming anytime on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Forum Daily Week in Review. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll catch you on Monday for a brand new episode of Forum Daily.